Boston Mobster's Revenge. In 1981, John McIntyre agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in Boston about drug smuggling and gun-running operations. McIntyre had been involved with organized crime in South Boston and had information about major criminal operations that stretched from Boston to Ireland. His knowledge was extensive. He could testify about drug shipments worth millions, weapons trafficking to the IRA, and the organizational structure of Boston's most powerful crime families. McIntyre provided information about a massive gun shipment to the IRA that had been smuggled aboard a fishing vessel called the Valhalla. He described how weapons were purchased, how they were hidden, who organized the shipment, and where the money came from. His testimony would be crucial in prosecuting several high-level criminals, including some who had operated with apparent immunity for years. Federal agents assured him he would be safe and that his cooperation would remain confidential until trial. They told him the FBI would protect him and that no one would know about his cooperation until he testified in court. But there was a problem the federal agents didn't know about or chose to ignore. One of their own top informants was James Whitey Bulger, the most powerful organized crime figure in Boston, and the man behind much of the criminal activity McIntyre was describing. And Bulger had a corrupt FBI handler, Special Agent John Connolly, who had grown up in South Boston with Bulger and had maintained a close, inappropriate relationship with the mobster for years. Connolly wasn't just protecting Bulger as an informant, he was actively working for him, providing information about investigations, warning him about surveillance, and identifying witnesses who were cooperating against him. When McIntyre entered witness protection, Connolly informed Bulger that McIntyre was cooperating with federal investigators. Connolly provided Bulger with specific details about what McIntyre had told investigators, including information about the Valhalla gun shipment and other criminal operations that Bulger himself was involved in. Connolly also told Bulger where McIntyre was being held in protective custody and what the security arrangements were. In November 1984, McIntyre was lured to a house in South Boston under false pretenses. He was told by someone he trusted, possibly someone connected to law enforcement, that he needed to meet with associates about a business opportunity that would help him get established in his new life after testifying. The meeting was described as routine and safe. Instead, when McIntyre arrived at the house on East 3rd Street, he was confronted by Bulger and several associates including Stephen Flemmi and Kevin Weeks. They were waiting for him specifically, knew exactly when he would arrive, and had prepared the house for what would happen next. They interrogated him about his cooperation with federal investigators, asking specific questions about exactly what he had told the FBI, who he had named, what evidence he had provided. The specificity of their questions made it clear they had detailed information that could only have come from someone inside law enforcement who had access to McIntyre's debriefing reports. They knew things that McIntyre had told only FBI agents in confidential interviews. McIntyre was tortured for hours before being killed. According to later testimony from Kevin Weeks, who was present at the murder, McIntyre was chained to a chair and questioned extensively. When Bulger was satisfied he had extracted all useful information, he shot McIntyre. His body was buried in a secret location in Dorchester and wouldn't be discovered until 2000, when former Bulger associate Stephen Flemmi led authorities to the burial site as part of his own cooperation agreement. The truth about McIntyre's murder emerged during later investigations into FBI corruption in Boston. It was revealed that Agent Connolly had been on Bulger's payroll for years, receiving cash payments, expensive gifts, and other benefits in exchange for protecting Bulger's criminal operations. Connolly had specifically told Bulger that McIntyre was cooperating and was being protected by federal authorities. He had provided Bulger with enough information to identify McIntyre, locate him, and plan his murder. Connolly's FBI supervisor, John Morris, had also received payments from Bulger and had helped protect the mobster from investigation. McIntyre had followed all the rules of witness protection. He had cut off contact with his previous associates, had relocated as instructed, and was cooperating fully with investigators. He had done everything the FBI asked him to do, but the protection meant nothing because the leak came from inside the FBI itself. The very agency protecting him had an agent who was working for the criminals he was testifying against. The agent who was supposed to keep him safe was the one who got him killed. In 2002, John Connolly was convicted of racketeering and obstruction of justice. In 2008, he was convicted of second-degree murder for his role in a separate murder orchestrated by Bulger, the 1982 killing of businessman John Callahan, who was also murdered because Connolly had identified him as a potential witness. The conviction acknowledged that Connolly's leaks to Bulger had directly led to multiple murders, including McIntyre's. The McIntyre case exposed catastrophic failures in FBI oversight in Boston during the 1980s and 1990s. An FBI agent had been corrupted by an organized crime boss and had leaked the identities and locations of protected witnesses, leading to multiple murders. The agency that was supposed to protect witnesses had instead gotten them killed. Congressional investigations found that FBI supervisors had ignored warning signs about Connolly's relationship with Bulger, had failed to properly oversee the informant relationship, and had prioritized protecting their star informant over protecting the witnesses testifying against other criminals. The Sicilian prosecutor's informant. In 1992, Italian businessman and mafia informant Francesco Marino Manoia was one of the most valuable witnesses in the Italian government's war against the Sicilian mafia. Manoia had been a high-level mafia member, a chemist who had worked in heroin laboratories refining drugs for trafficking and had detailed knowledge of mafia operations, corruption networks, and criminal activities across Sicily and mainland Italy. He knew about political connections, which police officers and judges were on the mafia payroll, and the internal structure of several major mafia families. After his arrest in 1989, Manoia made a calculated decision to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for protection and a reduced sentence. He became one of the first high-ranking mafia members to break the code of omertà, silence, and testify against the organization. This was an extraordinary betrayal by mafia standards. Members are expected to go to prison and remain silent, and those who cooperate are considered the worst kind of traitor. His testimony was crucial in the Maxi trials that convicted hundreds of mafia members and exposed the scope of mafia infiltration into Italian society, business, and government. Manoia was placed in maximum security witness protection in Italy. He was held in a secret location with round-the-clock armed police protection. His movements were restricted and monitored. His family was also placed under protection at separate locations to prevent the mafia from using them as leverage against him. Italian authorities assured him that despite the mafia's reach and power, they could protect him and his family. They told him that the state was stronger than the mafia and that the era of mafia impunity was ending. But in July 1992, just months after some of the most significant mafia convictions based on his testimony, Manoia's sister, Agostina Manoia, was murdered in Palermo despite being under police protection. She was killed by a car bomb, a signature mafia execution method that sends a clear message. The bomb was placed in a vehicle she used regularly, a car that was supposed to be checked by police before she used it as part of her protection protocol. The explosion killed her instantly and injured several bystanders. The sophistication of the bomb and the precise timing suggested the killers had been watching her for some time, tracking her movements and patterns despite the supposed police surveillance. The murder was a direct message to Francesco Manoia and other potential informants. Witness protection couldn't save them or their families. Even with police protection, even in supposedly secure locations, even with guards and surveillance, the mafia could reach them. The message was clear: cooperation equals death, not just for the informant, but for everyone they love. Investigations revealed that the mafia had obtained detailed information about Agostina Manoia's location and protection arrangements through corrupt police officers. Several officers in the Palermo Police Department were on the mafia's payroll and had access to witness protection information. They had leaked Agostina's address, her daily routines, details about her protection schedule, when guards changed shifts, and which vehicle she would be using on the day of the murder. The leak was so complete that the killers knew exactly when and where to place the bomb for maximum effect. The murder occurred just 2 months after the assassination of anti-mafia judge Giovanni Falcone, who had been killed along with his wife and 3 bodyguards by a massive bomb placed under a highway near Palermo. The Falcone assassination had used half a ton of explosives and required detailed inside information about the judge's route and timing. The Falcone assassination and the murder of Manoia's sister demonstrated the mafia's ability to penetrate even the highest levels of security and protection. If they could kill Italy's most prominent anti-mafia prosecutor, despite his extensive protection, they could certainly reach the family member of an informant. Francesco Manoia survived and continued to cooperate with prosecutors, providing testimony in dozens of trials. But the murder of his sister, while under protection, devastated him and affected his testimony. In interviews years later, he described the betrayal with anger, still evident decades after the event. "They promised my family would be safe. They looked me in the eye and promised that the state would protect my sister. They promised the mafia couldn't reach us because we were under protection. But corrupt police gave them everything they needed: her address, her schedule, her car, everything. My sister died because someone inside the system was working for the people we were fighting. She died because I trusted the state to keep her safe, and they failed." The case exposed widespread corruption within Italian law enforcement in the early 1990s. Multiple police officers were eventually convicted of providing information to the mafia about protected witnesses and their families. But the revelation came too late for Agostina Manoia and several other family members of informants who were killed during this period. The corruption was so deep that even after the convictions, questions remained about how many other officers might be compromised and whether witness protection could ever truly be secure in regions where the mafia had been operating for generations. The cartel witness betrayal. In 1997, a Mexican federal police officer agreed to testify against the Juarez cartel, one of the most powerful and violent drug trafficking organizations in Mexico, and one of the primary suppliers of cocaine to the United States. The officer, whose identity was protected under the pseudonym Testigo Uno, Witness 1, in all official documents, had detailed knowledge of cartel operations worth billions of dollars, corruption networks that reached the highest levels of Mexican government, and connections between the cartel and politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials across Mexico. Testigo Uno hadn't started as a corruption investigator. He had been a mid-level federal police officer who had been forced to cooperate with the cartel through a combination of bribes and threats, the cartel's standard approach to corrupting law enforcement. But over time, he had become disgusted with what he was being forced to do and had secretly documented the corruption. He had names, dates, recorded conversations, financial records, and evidence of dozens of corrupt officials. His testimony would be crucial in prosecuting not just cartel leaders, but also the network of corrupt government officials who made the cartel's operations possible. When he finally decided to come forward, he approached officials from the Mexican Attorney General's office who specialized in anti-corruption investigations. They convinced him to cooperate and promised him protection. In exchange for his testimony, he was placed in a Mexican witness protection program that was being reformed and strengthened specifically to handle high-risk witnesses in cartel cases. He was promised security for himself and his family, relocated to a secure location, and given armed guards around the clock. The Mexican authorities relocated Testigo Uno to what was described as a secure safe house in a location outside Mexico City. He was provided with armed guards from a special unit that had been vetted for corruption. His family, a wife and 2 children aged 8 and 11, was also placed under protection at a separate location approximately 50 kilometers away with their own security detail. He was scheduled to testify in federal court in Mexico City in a high-profile trial against cartel leadership that was being described as the most significant prosecution of cartel members in Mexican history. In August 1997, 3 weeks before his scheduled testimony, Testigo Uno was murdered at his protected location. The attack came early in the morning. Gunmen arrived in multiple vehicles, attacked the safe house where he was being held with overwhelming force, killed his 4 police guards in a brief but intense firefight, and executed him with multiple shots to the head and chest. The attack was coordinated and professional, with the gunmen showing military-level training and tactics. The precision of the attack suggested the attackers knew exactly where to find him, how many guards would be present, what weapons they would have, and the layout of the safe house. Within hours of Testigo Uno's murder, before authorities even had time to respond to the first attack, his wife and 2 children were also killed at their separate protected location, 50 kilometers away. Again, the attackers knew exactly where the family was being held and struck with precision. They killed the 3 police guards protecting the family and then executed the wife and children. The coordinated nature of the 2 simultaneous attacks, at locations that were supposed to be secret and known only to a small number of officials, indicated that detailed information had been leaked from within the protection program itself. Investigations later revealed that the Juarez cartel had infiltrated Mexican federal police at very high levels. Several officers involved in organizing and running the witness protection program were on the cartel's payroll, receiving regular payments that often exceeded their official salaries by 10 times or more. They had provided the cartel with Testigo Uno's exact location, his family's exact location, detailed floor plans of both safe houses, information about security arrangements, the number and names of guards, their shift schedules, and even details about what weapons the guards carried and what tactical training they had. The officers who leaked the information were eventually identified through phone records and financial investigations that traced payments from cartel members. Several were arrested and charged with corruption, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. However, most were released within months due to lack of direct evidence linking them to the murders, as opposed to just taking bribes, legal technicalities in how evidence was collected, or pressure on prosecutors. Several of the arrested officers were later found murdered themselves, killed by the cartel to ensure their silence about cartel operations, and to send another message to law enforcement about the consequences of attracting attention. The case demonstrated the fundamental problem with witness protection in Mexico during the 1990s and continuing into the 2000s. The cartels had so thoroughly corrupted law enforcement through a combination of bribes and threats that witness protection programs were essentially useless. Witnesses who cooperated with authorities were signing their own death warrants because the information about their protection was being sold to the very criminals they were testifying against almost as soon as the protection arrangements were made. A 2010 investigation by the Mexican federal government found that between 1995 and 2005, at least 127 protected witnesses or their family members had been murdered despite being in official protection programs. The investigation concluded that systematic corruption and cartel infiltration of law enforcement at federal, state, and local levels had rendered witness protection programs ineffective. The report recommended essentially starting over with witness protection using only specially vetted personnel and keeping protection information compartmentalized, so no single official had access to all details about any witness. But implementing these reforms proved difficult in a system where corruption was so endemic. The Russian defector. In 2006, Alexander Litvinenko, a former Russian FSB, Federal Security Service, officer who had defected to the United Kingdom and been granted asylum, was under British protection as a key witness in multiple investigations into Russian organized crime and alleged corruption within Russian intelligence services. Litvinenko had provided extensive testimony about connections between Russian intelligence agencies, organized crime groups, and the Russian government. His information was valuable to British, Spanish, and other European intelligence services investigating Russian criminal activities in Europe. Litvinenko had fled Russia in 2000 after accusing his FSB superiors of ordering him to assassinate Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky, a Kremlin critic who had also fled to London. Litvinenko refused the order and instead went public with accusations of corruption within the FSB. He escaped Russia with his family and was granted asylum in the United Kingdom. He continued to work as a consultant for British intelligence services, Spanish prosecutors investigating Russian mafia activities, and various media outlets reporting on Russian affairs. He was also a vocal critic of the Russian government and President Vladimir Putin, publishing articles and giving interviews accusing the Kremlin of various crimes. In October 2006, Litvinenko was scheduled to testify in a Spanish investigation into Russian mafia activities and money laundering operations in Spain. He was also working with British authorities on investigations into Russian criminal networks operating in London. British authorities had assured him multiple times that he was safe in the UK and that Russian intelligence services couldn't reach him there. They provided him with periodic security briefings and had advised him on basic security measures, but he wasn't under full-time protection or surveillance. British intelligence apparently believed that while Russia might want Litvinenko dead, they wouldn't risk an operation on British soil that could cause a major diplomatic incident. On November 1, 2006, Litvinenko met with two former Russian contacts, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, at the Pine Bar in the Millennium Hotel in Grosvenor Square, London. Both men were former Russian intelligence officers, and Litvinenko had known them during his time with the FSB. They had contacted him claiming to have information about the death of Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who had been murdered in Moscow a month earlier. Litvinenko met with them to discuss this information. During this meeting, at some point during their conversation, Litvinenko consumed tea that had been poisoned with polonium-210, a highly radioactive substance. Litvinenko became violently ill within hours of the meeting. He experienced severe vomiting, diarrhea, and pain. Initially, doctors thought he had food poisoning or a stomach virus, but his condition rapidly deteriorated over the following days. He lost his hair, his immune system collapsed, and his organs began failing. Medical tests eventually identified polonium-210 in his system, a discovery that shocked doctors because polonium-210 is extraordinarily rare and requires sophisticated nuclear facilities to produce. Before his death on November 23, 2006, Litvinenko gave extensive statements to investigators from his hospital bed. He told them that he believed he had been poisoned by Russian agents on orders from the Kremlin. He specifically named Lugovoy and Kovtun as the people who had poisoned him. He said, "You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protest from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life." The British investigation, which became one of the largest and most complex in British police history, confirmed that Litvinenko had been poisoned with polonium-210, and radioactive traces were found in multiple locations that Lugovoy and Kovtun had visited in London. Investigators found polonium contamination in the hotel bar where they met Litvinenko, in several other hotels where the two men had stayed, in restaurants they had visited, on the British Airways planes they had flown on, and even in the teapot used to serve Litvinenko his tea. The contamination trail allowed investigators to track the movements of the poison through London. The investigation concluded that Lugovoy and Kovtun had deliberately poisoned Litvinenko, likely by putting polonium-210 in his tea during their meeting. The amount of polonium used was massive, far more than necessary to kill one person, suggesting either poor handling or intentional use of an excessive amount to ensure death. The investigation also found that this wasn't their first attempt. Evidence suggested they may have tried to poison Litvinenko at earlier meetings, but failed. What made this case particularly alarming from a witness protection perspective was that Litvinenko was murdered despite being under British protection and surveillance. Russian agents had operated in London, obtained a highly radioactive poison, carried it through British airports and customs, moved it through London hotels and restaurants, leaving a trail of radioactive contamination, and successfully killed a protected witness. The sophistication of the operation and the use of polonium-210, a substance that requires state resources and nuclear facilities to obtain, suggested this was a state-sponsored assassination, not the work of criminals or rogue agents. A 2016 British public inquiry led by Judge Robert Owen concluded that Lugovoy and Kovtun had poisoned Litvinenko, and that the operation was probably approved by Russian President Vladimir Putin and FSB Director Nikolai Patrushev. The inquiry found that Litvinenko's work for British intelligence and his public criticism of Putin and the FSB had made him a target for assassination. Russia refused to extradite the suspects, and both remain in Russia, where Lugovoy is now a member of parliament with immunity from prosecution. The Litvinenko case demonstrated that witness protection programs are vulnerable when dealing with state-level actors who have significant resources, determination, and willingness to take risks. British authorities had believed they could protect Litvinenko from Russian retaliation, but they had underestimated the lengths to which Russian intelligence would go to silence him, and the sophistication of the methods they would use. The use of polonium-210 was particularly alarming because it's so difficult to detect without specific equipment, meaning the poison could have been used successfully even in a more secured environment. The Albanian gang informant. In 2003, a witness testifying against an Albanian organized crime network in Belgium was murdered despite being in the Belgian Witness Protection Program. The witness, whose identity was protected under Belgian law and was never publicly released, had provided testimony about human trafficking operations that brought women from Eastern Europe into prostitution in Western Europe, drug smuggling networks that moved heroin from Turkey through the Balkans into Belgium and other EU countries, and murder-for-hire operations run by Albanian gangs operating across Europe. His testimony implicated over 30 individuals in multiple countries. The witness had been a member of the Albanian gang himself, involved in their operations for several years before deciding to cooperate with police. His decision to testify was motivated by both fear and disgust. He had witnessed several murders carried out by the gang and had come to believe that he would eventually be killed himself, as the organization eliminated people who knew too much. When he approached Belgian police, he provided them with detailed information about gang operations, including locations where victims were held, names of corrupt officials who facilitated the trafficking, and financial records showing how proceeds were laundered. The witness had been relocated to a secure apartment in Brussels with supposedly 24-hour police protection. Belgian authorities had assured him that his location was known only to a small number of trusted officers who had been carefully vetted, and that the Albanian gangs, while violent and well-connected, would not be able to find him in the secure location. The apartment building had security cameras. The apartment itself was on an upper floor requiring access through a locked entrance, and 2 armed police officers were always supposed to be present in the apartment with the witness. In March 2003, gunmen entered the witness's protected apartment and shot him multiple times, killing him instantly. They also killed the 2 police officers who were guarding him at the time. The attackers escaped through the same route they had entered and were never apprehended, though police suspected they were professional hitmen hired by the Albanian gang and brought in specifically for this operation. The precision of the attack, knowing the exact apartment, the exact time when only 2 guards would be present, and having detailed floor plans of the building and apartment layout, indicated the attackers had detailed information from inside the protection program. The investigation revealed a shocking betrayal. One of the police officers involved in coordinating the witness protection program had been bribed by the Albanian gang. The corrupt officer had provided the gang with comprehensive information: the witness's address, the exact apartment number, security arrangements including camera locations and how to avoid them, the schedule of guard rotations when the apartment would be least defended, and even floor plans showing the layout of the apartment and which room the witness would likely be in at different times of day. The corrupt officer had been receiving payments from the gang for several months before the murder, initially just providing minor information about police operations. When the gang learned that a witness was testifying against them, they approached the officer and offered a substantial payment for information about the witness's protection arrangements. The officer, who was apparently deeply in debt from gambling, agreed. He was paid approximately 50,000 euros for the information that led to the witness's murder. The corrupt officer was arrested within weeks of the murder after financial investigators traced unusual deposits to his bank account. During interrogation, he initially denied involvement, but eventually confessed when confronted with the financial evidence and phone records showing contact with known gang members. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years for corruption, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory to murder. However, his conviction was cold comfort. The witness was dead, and the gang members he was testifying against were acquitted due to lack of evidence. Without his testimony, prosecutors couldn't prove their case. This case highlighted a critical and recurring vulnerability in witness protection programs. They're only as secure as the people running them. No matter how sophisticated the security measures, secure locations, armed guards, surveillance cameras, restricted access to information, if someone inside the system can be corrupted or compromised through bribes or threats, the entire program can be penetrated. One corrupt officer with access to the right information can undo all the security measures and get a witness killed. Belgian authorities conducted a comprehensive review of their entire witness protection program after this murder. They found multiple security vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. Too many people had access to protected witness information, with insufficient oversight of who was accessing what. Background checks on protection officers were inadequate and didn't include financial reviews that might identify officers vulnerable to bribery. And there were insufficient safeguards against insider threats. They implemented new procedures including compartmentalization of information, mandatory financial monitoring of officers with access to witness protection information, and requirements for multiple officers to confirm security arrangements so no single officer had complete control. The Balkan War Crimes Witness. In 2000, a witness scheduled to testify at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, was murdered despite being under UN protection. The witness had agreed to testify about war crimes committed during the Bosnian War, including evidence about mass executions of civilians, ethnic cleansing operations, and the systematic use of rape as a weapon of war. His testimony would be crucial in prosecuting several high-ranking military and political leaders accused of crimes against humanity. The witness was living under UN protection in a secure location in the Netherlands, where the ICTY is based in The Hague. The protection program was managed by Dutch authorities in cooperation with international security services and the tribunal's own witness protection unit. The witness's identity was supposed to be confidential, known only to tribunal prosecutors, a small security team, and essential personnel. His name had been redacted from public court documents, and he was referred to only by a number in tribunal proceedings. In June 2000, the witness was found dead in his protected apartment in what was initially reported by police as a suicide. However, later investigations revealed significant evidence suggesting murder. The witness had been strangled, and physical evidence suggested a struggle had occurred. The scene had been staged to look like suicide by hanging, but forensic experts found injuries inconsistent with suicide, including defensive wounds on his hands and arms, bruising suggesting he had been held down, and evidence that he had been strangled before being hanged. The initial suicide ruling appeared to be the result of inadequate investigation rather than deliberate cover-up. Investigations revealed that information about the witness's identity and location had been leaked to individuals connected to those being prosecuted for war crimes. The leak came through a complex network involving several compromised individuals. First, someone in the Balkans with access to tribunal information had identified the witness despite the anonymity precautions. Then, this information was passed through connections to intelligence services and organized crime networks that still operated in former Yugoslavia. Finally, the information reached people in the Netherlands who were connected to these networks and could act on the information. The specific mechanism of the leak was never fully determined, but investigations found that several tribunal employees and Dutch security personnel had connections to individuals from the former Yugoslavia who had ties to those being prosecuted. In the close-knit expatriate communities from the Balkans living in the Netherlands, information could flow through social connections, family relationships, or shared ethnic or political loyalties. The tribunal's assumption that protecting a witness in the Netherlands would be safe because it was far from the Balkans hadn't accounted for how extensive the diaspora networks were and how they could be exploited to reach witnesses. The ICTY was forced to acknowledge that witness protection had failed and that a witness had been murdered while under their protection. In response to this and other security breaches around the same time, the tribunal implemented stronger protection measures, stricter vetting of personnel with access to witness information, better compartmentalization of witness identities, enhanced physical security for protected witnesses, and improved cooperation with Dutch intelligence services to monitor potential threats. But the damage was done. Multiple witnesses refused to testify after learning about the murder, citing fear that they couldn't be protected. Several cases were significantly weakened or ultimately dismissed due to lack of witness cooperation. The murder highlighted the unique challenges of protecting witnesses in international war crimes tribunals. Unlike domestic criminal cases where the defendants are typically career criminals with limited resources, war crimes cases involve powerful individuals with international networks, significant financial resources, connections to intelligence services, and networks of loyal supporters who may be willing to take extreme actions. Many defendants in war crimes cases were former military or political leaders who retained connections to security services, organized crime groups that operate across borders, and diaspora communities in multiple countries. The Philippine Drug War Informant. In 2017, during the Philippines' controversial drug war under President Rodrigo Duterte, a witness who had provided testimony about extrajudicial killings by police was murdered despite being enrolled in the Philippine government's Witness Protection Program. The witness had testified that police officers had executed suspected drug dealers and users without trial, had planted evidence to justify the killings, and had received orders and tacit approval from superior officers for these extrajudicial killings. His testimony was part of a human rights investigation that was examining whether the drug war policies constituted crimes against humanity. The witness's testimony was particularly damaging because he had been a police informant himself, someone who had worked with police to identify drug suspects. He had witnessed multiple killings and could testify about how the operations worked. Police would identify targets based on informant information or anonymous tips, would raid homes or make arrests, and would then shoot suspects while claiming they had fought back or tried to escape. The witness described a systematic pattern of extrajudicial execution rather than isolated incidents, and he could name specific officers, dates, and victims. The witness had been relocated under the Department of Justice Witness Protection Program and was supposedly under secure protection. The program had assured him that his identity would be protected, that his location would be secret, and that he would be safe until he could testify in court. They told him that despite the controversy around the drug war, the government would protect witnesses who came forward with evidence of wrongdoing. In August 2017, gunmen on motorcycles, a common method of assassination in the Philippines known as riding in tandem, shot and killed the witness outside his supposedly protected location. The attack occurred in broad daylight on a busy street. The witness had been outside his secure apartment, and the killers apparently knew exactly where to find him and what time he would be outside. The gunmen approached quickly, one driving the motorcycle and one shooting, killed the witness with multiple shots to the head and chest, and escaped through traffic before police could respond. Witnesses to the shooting reported that the killers seemed to know exactly where their target would be and what he looked like. Philippine human rights organizations immediately accused the government of either deliberately leaking the witness's location or failing to provide adequate protection. They pointed to this murder and several similar cases as evidence that witnesses who testified against police in drug war cases couldn't be protected. The Department of Justice denied these allegations, claiming the witness had violated protection program rules by leaving his secure location. They suggested he had been careless with his security and had exposed himself to danger. However, investigators found that the witness had been outside his protected location, following instructions from someone claiming to be a protection program coordinator. The witness had received a call on his secure phone, a phone that was supposed to be known only to program officials, telling him to meet at a specific location outside his apartment for a security briefing. The caller provided the witness with details that made the call seem legitimate, including references to his case and his assigned protection officers. When he arrived at the meeting location as instructed, he was assassinated. The investigation into who made the call to lure the witness into the open was never completed. Despite the phone call being traced to a number that was supposed to be internal to the Department of Justice, no one was ever identified as making the call, and no one was arrested in connection with the murder. Human rights organizations concluded that the witness was deliberately set up by individuals within the protection program itself, people who were sympathetic to or involved in the extrajudicial killings he was testifying about. The case caused several other witnesses who had been prepared to testify about police killings during the drug war to refuse cooperation or to flee the country. Human rights investigators reported that at least 6 witnesses in drug war cases either withdrew their cooperation, went into hiding outside the Witness Protection Program, or fled the Philippines entirely between 2017 and 2019 because they no longer trusted that they could be protected. The Colombian Drug Informant. In 2009, a former member of a Colombian drug trafficking organization, who had agreed to testify against his former associates, was killed in the United States despite being in the U.S. Marshals Service Witness Protection Program, WITSEC, which is generally considered one of the most secure and effective witness protection programs in the world. The informant had provided extensive testimony about drug smuggling routes, money laundering operations, and corruption networks that involved American officials. The informant had been a high-level member of a Colombian drug cartel operating primarily in cocaine trafficking from Colombia to the United States. After his arrest in Colombia in 2005, he had agreed to cooperate with U.S. authorities in exchange for reduced charges and entry into witness protection. He was extradited to the United States, testified in several major drug trafficking cases, and provided information that led to the seizure of millions of dollars worth of drugs and the arrest of numerous traffickers. After completing his testimony, the informant was relocated to a mid-sized city in the southeastern United States under a completely new identity provided by WITSEC. He was following all program rules. He had cut off contact with his previous associates, hadn't contacted family members in Colombia, was using his new identity consistently, and was cooperating fully with his U.S. Marshals handlers. The Marshals Service assured him that he was safe and that the drug traffickers couldn't reach him in the United States under his new identity. In June 2009, the informant was shot and killed outside a grocery store in the city where he had been relocated. The killing was professional and efficient. A single shooter who approached quickly from behind, fired multiple shots at close range, and escaped on foot to a waiting vehicle. Witnesses reported that the shooter seemed to know exactly who the target was and where to find him, despite his new identity. The killing had all the hallmarks of a professional hit, rather than a random crime. The investigation revealed that the informant's new identity and general location had been discovered through a combination of factors. First, investigators found that the informant had violated program rules by maintaining limited contact with family members in Colombia. Despite being told not to contact anyone from his previous life, he had called his elderly mother several times using burner phones he had purchased. While he had been careful not to reveal his exact location or new identity, phone records showed he had made these calls, and sophisticated analysis of phone tower data by the cartel could have provided a general geographic area where he was located. However, more concerning was evidence that information about the informant's general relocation area had leaked from within the U.S. justice system, though not from WITSEC itself. Court documents related to his testimony had been filed in federal court, with what was later determined to be insufficient redaction. While his new identity and exact location weren't revealed, the documents contained clues about where he had been relocated, references to his resettlement, mentions of the southeastern United States in context that shouldn't have been included, and other details that someone analyzing multiple documents could piece together. Additionally, a paralegal working for defense attorneys in one of the cases where the informant had testified had conducted computer searches that suggested efforts to locate him. The paralegal had searched for information about WITSEC relocation patterns, had looked up cities in the southeastern United States that were common relocation destinations, and had conducted searches combining the informant's old name with various city names. While the paralegal was never charged with a crime and denied any wrongdoing, investigators found that information from those searches had somehow reached individuals connected to the Colombian drug organization through a series of intermediaries. The exact mechanism of how the information traveled from the legal team to the killers was never conclusively determined, but the investigation found evidence suggesting the information had been sold through intermediaries, people who collected and sold sensitive information to various criminal organizations. The paralegal may have sold the information directly, or may have shared it with someone who then sold it, or the searches themselves may have been detected by cartel associates who were monitoring for exactly this kind of activity. The case highlighted vulnerabilities in the witness protection system that exist beyond direct leaks from law enforcement. Court documents, legal filings, and information accessible to defense teams can sometimes contain clues about witness locations, even when properly redacted according to standard procedures. Determined criminal organizations with significant resources can piece together information from multiple sources: court records, intercepted phone calls, analysis of investigation patterns, and other intelligence-gathering methods to narrow down where a protected witness might be located. The Greek terrorist informant. In 2013, a former member of a Greek domestic terrorist organization who had agreed to testify against his former associates was murdered despite being under police protection in Greece. The informant had detailed knowledge of terrorist operations, bombing campaigns that had targeted police stations and government buildings, and the organization's support network that included sympathizers in various sectors of Greek society, including academia, labor unions, and, surprisingly, elements within law enforcement itself. The informant was being held in a supposedly secure police facility in Athens, with 24-hour armed protection while awaiting trial. He was scheduled to testify in trials against multiple members of the terrorist organization, providing testimony that would likely result in long prison sentences for those convicted. Greek authorities had assured him of his safety, and had implemented what they described as strict security protocols to prevent the terrorist organization from reaching him. In April 2013, the informant was found dead in his cell in the supposedly secure facility. The official explanation provided by police was suicide by hanging. They claimed he had used bed sheets to hang himself from a fixture in his cell. However, this explanation was immediately questioned by forensic experts, the informant's family, and human rights organizations who examined the case. Evidence strongly suggested this was physically impossible given the configuration of the cell. The cell had been designed specifically to prevent suicide, with no fixtures at appropriate height for hanging, and the bed sheets weren't long or strong enough to support body weight in the manner described. Additionally, medical examiners found evidence that was inconsistent with suicide. The injuries to the neck were wrong for hanging, there were bruises and marks suggesting the informant had been strangled before being hanged, and there was evidence of a struggle, including defensive wounds on his hands. The investigation revealed that someone with authorized access to the secure facility had either killed the informant directly or had allowed others access to the facility to carry out the murder. Several police officers who had access to the facility during the relevant time period were investigated, but no charges were ever filed due to lack of direct evidence. Each officer had a plausible reason for being in the facility, and none of them could be definitively placed at the informant's cell at the time of death. Greek anti-terrorism prosecutors eventually concluded that the murder was likely carried out by or facilitated by individuals within law enforcement who were sympathetic to the terrorist organization or who had been threatened or bribed by the organization's supporters. Greece has a long and complex history of political violence dating back decades, with various left-wing and right-wing terrorist organizations operating over the years. Some of these organizations had support bases within certain sectors of society, and investigations had previously uncovered connections between some police officers and extremist political groups. The political nature of domestic terrorism in Greece made protecting witnesses particularly difficult. Unlike protecting witnesses against purely criminal organizations, protecting witnesses against terrorist organizations that had ideological supporters created unique challenges. Some officers might sympathize with the political goals of the organization, even if they didn't support violent methods. Others might have family members or friends who were sympathizers. This created a situation where determining who could be trusted with witness protection was extraordinarily difficult. The informant's murder caused other potential witnesses against the terrorist organization to refuse cooperation with authorities. Several individuals who had been considering testifying withdrew their offers of cooperation, citing the murder as proof that police couldn't protect them. Several trials were delayed indefinitely or dismissed due to lack of witness testimony, allowing suspected terrorists to avoid prosecution. The Northern Ireland Supergrass. In 1982, during the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, a former IRA member who had agreed to turn supergrass, British term for informant who testifies against large numbers of associates, against the organization, was found dead despite being under Royal Ulster Constabulary protection. The informant had agreed to testify against dozens of IRA members in what would have been the largest mass prosecution of the organization's members, potentially leading to convictions that would have significantly damaged IRA operations in the region. The informant had been an active IRA member involved in weapons procurement and bombings. After his arrest in 1981, he agreed to cooperate with authorities, providing detailed testimony about IRA operations, naming members, describing the organizational structure, and providing evidence about specific attacks. His testimony would potentially lead to prosecutions against over 40 individuals, including some high-ranking IRA members. The informant was being held at a secure RUC facility with armed guards and restricted access. British authorities had assured him that despite the IRA's reach and capabilities, they could protect him through the trial process and would then relocate him with a new identity to either mainland Britain or another country. They told him the IRA couldn't penetrate the secure facility and that by testifying, he would be helping to end the violence that had plagued Northern Ireland for over a decade. In November 1982, the informant was found dead at the facility. The official explanation was that he had committed suicide by hanging in his cell. However, his family immediately disputed this explanation, pointing to evidence that suggested foul play. The informant had been in good spirits when they last visited him, had been making plans for his future after testifying and relocating, and had shown no signs of depression or suicidal ideation. Medical examinations of the body found injuries that were inconsistent with suicide, bruising that suggested he had been in a physical altercation shortly before death, marks on his wrists suggesting he had been restrained, and questions about whether the hanging injuries matched the scenario described in the official report. Investigations conducted years later, after documents related to the troubles were declassified under various historical review processes, revealed disturbing information. British intelligence services had been warned by their own sources about security vulnerabilities at the facility where the informant was being held. Informants had reported that the IRA had intelligence sources within the RUC who could provide information about facilities, guard schedules, and possibly even access. These warnings had been documented but apparently not acted upon effectively. Additionally, declassified documents suggested that British intelligence and the RUC had evidence that some officers within the RUC had Republican sympathies or family connections to IRA members that created potential security risks. While most RUC officers were staunchly opposed to the IRA, the complexity of Northern Irish society meant that even within the police force, there were complicated loyalties based on religion, family, and community. Some officers were suspected of passing information to the IRA, either out of sympathy due to threats against their families, or in some cases, because they themselves were IRA infiltrators. The case was never fully resolved, and key documents about the informant's death remain officially classified. However, investigative journalists who examined the case in the 1990s and 2000s after some documents were released found strong evidence suggesting that either the informant was murdered by individuals with authorized access to the facility, or security was deliberately compromised to allow IRA members access to kill him. The exact mechanism was never proven, but the evidence against suicide was substantial. The informant's death caused the collapse of the planned mass prosecution. Without his testimony, cases against dozens of IRA members fell apart. British authorities' credibility with potential informants was severely damaged. If they couldn't protect someone in a supposedly secure facility, how could they protect anyone? The supergrass strategy in Northern Ireland, which had been seen as a promising way to prosecute IRA members, was largely abandoned after this and several similar failures. 10 witnesses promised protection. 10 murders that should never have happened. John McIntyre followed every rule and died because an FBI agent sold him out to Whitey Bulger. The Sicilian informant's sister was killed because corrupt police sold her location to the mafia. The Mexican officer and his family were murdered because cartels owned the protection program. Litvinenko was poisoned in London despite British assurances. The Belgian witness died because one gambling-addicted cop sold his location for €50,000. These weren't cases where witnesses broke rules or exposed themselves. These were systematic failures where corrupt officials leaked locations, security was inadequate, or the agencies protecting witnesses were infiltrated by the organizations they were testifying against. Witness protection only works if the system is incorruptible. These 10 cases prove it often isn't. The U.S. Marshals claim perfect protection, but the Colombian informant died in America. The UN promised protection, but their witness was murdered. Location doesn't matter when the system itself is compromised. For witnesses considering cooperation, these cases pose an impossible question. Can you trust that the people protecting you aren't working for the people you're testifying against? Can you trust your location won't be leaked, sold, or discovered through bureaucratic failures? The criminal organizations wanted to send a message. Cooperation equals death, even with government protection. These 10 cases prove that message is true. Until witness protection programs can prevent both external threats and internal corruption, that message remains accurate. The witnesses trusted the system. The system failed them, and they paid with their lives.